ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Some years ago, Warren Brown wrote a book about an Australian adventurer named Francis Birtles, who became a national hero in the 1920s when Birtles performed the unimaginable feat of driving an open-top car named the Bean all the way from London to Australia. It was a jaunt that had Birtles crossing continents and shipping canals, connecting Europe to North Africa, Saudi Arabia and Southeast Asia. Along the way, Birtles confronted tigers with an elephant gun and had to literally pull his car over remote mountain ranges in Burma. It was madness. Warren Brown loved the story and thought, as any one of us might naturally think, I can do that. And so he did. Warren and his co-driver, Matthew Benn, set off from Leicester Square last year in a red Bean, a century-old car, just like Birtles did. Thankfully, he wasn't maimed, arrested or killed, and these men generated interest everywhere they went. And Warren today, I'm not kidding, is a media star in Saudi Arabia. Warren Brown, welcome back.
Thank you, Richard. What a delight to be here.
I'm so glad to see you here. I was going to call you Brown of Arabia. Is that what people are calling you?
No, they call me Warrants of Arabia. It fits. I like the mantle. I like the title Warrants of Arabia. I didn't come up with it, Richard, but I really like it. It's a fun thing.
Warrants of Arabia.
I can do the music. Na, 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 that kind of thing.
You are a river to your people. You are. So you decided years and years ago that you would like to replicate that journey in the same type of car,
yes.
The Bean. How did you procure your own Bean?
Well, it was interesting, Richard, because I'd been fascinated with the Francis Birtles story. Initially, I'd seen his Bean. It's in the National Museum of Australia in Canberra. When the museum opened in the year 2000, and what had happened was that Birtles had actually given his Bean 14 car to the Australian people. He didn't own it. The Bean Car Company owned it, but he gave it to the federal government on the condition that it would be put into into the museum in Canberra, in inverted commas. Well, there was none until the year 2000. And I went for a walk through the museum, and in the corner was this bashed-up car, and there was his Bean. So the story fascinated me no end because there was a brass plaque on the side and it said this car had driven from London to Melbourne, no less. And so I set about trying to find a Bean. And I mean, I'd never heard of one before, and I was a pretty switched on car guy. And they were a make of car that existed from about 1919 to 1929. I looked everywhere for a Bean all over the world, and they were thin on the ground, very, very thin on the ground. Then I got a lead that there was a car in Canberra, a Bean car in Canberra, and the body had been created on it as a replica of Francis Birtles' car. It belonged to a lovely chap called Alec McKernan. And so I paid a visit to Alec McKernan, and eventually he came around to selling the car. It had actually been a project since the 1960s, and he was the one who finally put the car together, and I bought it from him.
How did you prepare it for this epic journey?
Well, Richard, this is almost 20 years ago I bought the car. My son was only about 6 weeks old, and now he's finished his high school certificate. He's about to start at ANU. But I picked the car up from Alec McKernan and drove it from Canberra to Sydney. And then some old mechanic mates, Jeff Simmons and Lynn Brown and myself, we pulled the whole car to pieces, stripped it into every nut and bolt, and then rebuilt it. And then, I was planning on doing the trip across the world, and it was all happening, and then something would happen. The rug would be pulled out from under it one way or another. The last time it was COVID. And so recently, a mate of mine, Tony Jordan, a wonderful mechanic, he and I pulled the car to pieces for the last time for this great big preparation, and we got it right.
So the time came, COVID cleared, the stars were in alignment, and you were ready to go last year. So you shipped it over to London? You put it on a boat somewhere?
Yes, we did, Richard. We shipped it from Sydney to Southampton. But what's happened is that it's interesting to say about COVID happening. So we didn't know this. There are lots of vertical learning curves along the way, but COVID had really smashed shipping around the world to bits. And so it's very difficult to actually make shipping work like it once did. You used to be able to get these things called roll-on, roll-off drop-off ferry. So you drive a car onto it and then it delivers you to the other end and you drive off. Well, because of COVID, all these shipping companies went bust, so it was quite difficult to actually get the car shipped from Australia to England. And of course, we did get it there, and it arrived in Southampton eventually. It went, via Holland and via London and via all sorts of places unexpectedly, but it did turn up. And we had a support vehicle with us as well. So Tony, the mechanic, came with us. But as it turned out, the car, the Bean car, the 1925 Bean 14, never had a day by the side of the road, never had a puncture, never had an engine failure or a stoppage or anyway. The support vehicle, however, it was a different story altogether. So the Bean ended up being the support vehicle for the support vehicle.
Are you telling me, motoring-wise, we've actually gone backwards in 100 years?
Yeah, absolutely. So the support vehicle, the manufacturer will remain nameless, but it's a very famous American brand that's been around for a very, very long time. When it got to England, it conked out.
Does its name rhyme with board?
Yes, sawed off. Indeed, Richard. And, for a company that made, 16 million Model Ts, this particular vehicle, when it got off, rolled off the ship, it just, failed to proceed. And so we're just stuck in a dealership, some British dealership in Southampton for weeks. And so Matthew Benz and I decided, well, we've just got to keep going, So we drove across Europe and we had to wait. And so we're in Slovenia, of all places, with this 100-year-old car, waiting for the support vehicle that was still back in Southampton.
But you couldn't get support for the support vehicle.
No. So Matthew wrote a lovely email to the company and said, impending media disaster. It said, while our 100-year-old car is streaking across Europe, your car is still in Southampton, which got them all moving, yeah.
Okay, so the day came to set out from Leicester Square like Birtles did in this car. We're talking about an open-top car here too, by the way, aren't we?
My word, Richard. So it's a 100-year-old car and it has no roof and it has no doors and no windscreen as such and no seat belts. So whenever it's sunny, you get burnt and whenever it rains, you drown.
And you're wearing the gear of a 1920s motorist. And look, I'm going to embarrass you here, right? You look very handsome in that gear.
Oh,
it really suits you. You should wear it all the time. Was it practical to wear that kind of the clothing of a 1920s motorist?
Well, yes, it does have a sort of come hither look about it, I must say. But seriously, that gear that they used to wear years ago, in an open car, which, in those days was very common to be in an open car in all sorts of inclement weather, it works. So, long, leather driving coats and flying helmets and goggles and gauntlets and all that, it really works. And once you get used to it, now, I wore braces, belts and braces just to be sure. And Matthew and I both wore a tie every day and to look the part, and vests and that sort of thing. And it really worked. And wherever we went, people were fascinated with us, which was a lovely thing. So, yes, we had two farewells. One was at the Royal Automobile Club in Pall Mall in London, which was a splendid affair, Richard. It really, the Royal Automobile Club, how good does that get? And then the other was at Australia House on the Strand, which is precisely where Francis Birtles left in 1927. And when he was there in 1927, he had Miss Australia, Phyllis von Alban. She was there in 1927. Well, we couldn't get her. She was a tad old now to try and drag across the world. But we had Miss England, Miller McGee. She was there. And what a lovely, lovely person. She was great fun. And so, we were farewelled in exactly the same spot that Francis Birtles did.
Was your planned route more or less the same as Francis Birtles' route?
It was more or less, I'd say. And we'd always had a plan that, look, we're doing it in the spirit of Francis Birtles rather than trying to inch for inch copy exactly where his tyre tracks went, because you just physically can't do it anymore. So when Birtles did it in 1927-28, he'd already had one attempt at this in another Bean car, a prototype six-cylinder car, earlier on in 1927, and that expedition failed. Well, he ended up going through Turkey and trying to cross into Persia that way, ended up in India, but they'd had all sorts of troubles, imprisoned as spies in Turkey. So when he set off for the second time, he didn't go through Turkey. He shipped the car from the Piraeus in Athens to Alexandria in Egypt. So that's what we did. We followed that route. And so there were some things that we knew we couldn't do, and we tried to get into Myanmar, into Burma. But we had a very, very good contact in there, Damien Lay, a documentary maker, and he knows the country backwards. But even he was just saying it's so dangerous in there now. Like even if you get in, you'll never get out.
So you're going across Europe, shooting across there without your support vehicle, rocketing towards the Austrian Alps. What were conditions looking like?
Well, there's really only a certain time of year you can drive this particular route, and that is you don't want a European winter, you don't want a Saudi or an Arabian summer, you don't want an Asian monsoon. The payoff or the payback for that is you'll arrive in Australia in the wet season and summertime, but at least you're on home soil. But the weather in Europe was absolutely beautiful. We crossed the English Channel to Dunkirk, got to the hotel at night, and the next morning the hotel was actually at the beach where the memorial was for Dunkirk. So that was fascinating, where you could imagine, those hundreds of thousands of British and French troops all lined up on the beach there, like the movie
being strafed by Nazi planes.
Yeah, all of that. You can imagine that. It's Dunkirk. And the weather there was superb. In driving the open-top car through, that 100-year-old car, just powering along through all these countries. And eventually we made our way up the Austrian Alps and into the Alps. Well, the weather there was starting to get pretty rough because it's the Alps, obviously, and it's very steep, and it was sleeting. Not quite snowing, although there was quite a lot of snow about. Well, Matthew drove that particular day through the Alps, and I think he never quite got over it. It was a highlight in his life to do it. We'd take turns in driving a day each, that kind of thing, but going through the Austrian Alps was just spectacular. And of course, we saw, Matthew goes, there's Werfen, assigned to Werfen. I'm saying, what's Werfen? Well, that's where Eagles Dare. You know the movie with Clint Eastwood.
Right.
So that's the town of Werfen. And there is Schloss Adler. You can imagine it. You can imagine if the cable car was there, you can imagine them, Clint Eastwood and Richard Burton. And so we sort of marvelled at this, and that's where they filmed it.
Are you doing this on autobahns, and are you going fast enough on autobahns?
Yes. So one of the prerequisites that I had for the car from the very get-go was that it was to keep up with modern traffic. So we had made some alterations to the car.
Right, so you're not on an autobahn going pakada.
No, we're trying to keep up because on autobahns, of course, you can get fined or taken off the autobahn for being too slow. So before we'd left, I'd had the engine rebuilt. It's a genuine B14 engine, but it had been rebuilt by a racing engine place. But the prerequisite was not to make it a racing engine, make it like a truck engine so it would survive, and we had to do the hard yards. And then the differential at the rear, I don't want to get too technical, but we upgraded the ratio so it would sit in with modern traffic. So it would sit on about 95 to 100 kilometres an hour, which is pretty cool.
So you go down through there into Slovenia, in the former Yugoslavia.
Oh.
And what were conditions like there?
Oh, beautiful. Slovenia, I don't know if you've been to Slovenia, Richard, but it is the most wonderfully beautiful place. And Ljubljana is it's something out of a children's book. It's the most gorgeous place. And that's where Tony, with the support vehicle, caught up with us in Ljubljana. And I have to say, he was so emotional. I mean, he's a big guy, big Ted, we call him. But he was in tears that he'd finally, we'd all got back together again. And we never split up from then on. But going through those Balkan states, so I'm a big fan of Tintin, or Tintin, the Belgian comic strip character. And so being a cartoonist, this is all very visual for me. And what I'm looking at is a Tintin book, or various Tintin books in the places that we're going through. And going from Slovenia into Croatia, and then from Croatia into Montenegro into Albania, and Albania into Greece. It's the most spectacular countryside. And it changes. It's so beautiful and sophisticated in Slovenia. And the further south you go, towards the Greek border, by the time you get to Albania, it's a different country altogether.
Now in Croatia, you hit the mother of all storms?
Oh, yes, it was, Richard, indeed. And we were going to Zagreb. And it was Matthew's turn to drive that day. And, of course, we've got the flying goggles on, and they're starting to fill up with water like a fish bowl. I was expecting to see goldfish in my goggles, and because you can't empty them out. There's just rain everywhere. We were hit by this weather bomb rainstorm.
So you don't have a canopy or anything?
No.
So you're being bashed around the head with
absolutely.
all this?
And there's rain coming in all directions, up through the floorboards of the car, in at the sides, straight into your face, at the back of your head. And you're on virtually an autobahn. And Matthew says to me, I can't see. We're doing 100 kilometres an hour. And I said, that's okay. I can't see either. Keep going. So we powered on, and there's a wonderful photograph that someone a local took of us. They pulled up alongside us as we were driving along, and we're hunkered down, and you can just see the rain, and it's just powering into us. And they sent us the photograph. It's a wonderful photo. But when we arrived at our destination, we were drowned rats. The water gets into everywhere. It doesn't matter how well you're waterproofed. It just gets into every crevice, and you're absolutely wringing wet from eyebrows to toes,
So you think you're going into those former Soviet states of Montenegro and Albania was never Soviet, but it was communist.
Yes.
What are the conditions like there when you're going through those countries?
Well, Montenegro was a fascinating place. It sort of had a kind of tourist industry there. It's a little, I don't mean to be disparaging towards these countries, but they're a little bit backward compared to the rest of Europe, I have to say. But Albania, when you got into there, that was something else. Of course, Enver Hoxha was the great Stalinist dictator there for years and years, and I think he passed away in the 1980s maybe, or the 70s. He was there from World War II.
He took Albania out of the Soviet bloc and made it a Maoist China ally.
He did. Yes, that's right. And he was, I think it was the first communist country to become atheist by law. So the country, when you get there, it's never actually got out of its Cold War years. It sort of has this Cold War hangover, and we went to a place called Girecaster, which is this bizarre city on the side of a mountain, which is where Enver Hoxha was born. And the whole mountain that the city is built on is just riddled with tunnels for when World War III would break out. And he and his government would melt away into the mountain and they'd control Albania while the rest of the place suffered, a nuclear war. Quite extraordinary.
Meanwhile, you're still trying to plan getting your car from Europe to Egypt. How was all that going?
Well, this is the interesting thing, Richard. I mean, in Francis Birtles' time, he had to make do with, things. He had to play with the cards he was given with, and we were the same thing. We were in Albania or Montenegro, I can't quite remember, when news broke that Iran had launched 200 missiles into Israel, and then President Biden, Joe Biden, was running around and imploring, begging Israel, please do not retaliate at Iranian nuclear facilities. And so we're thinking, what does that mean for us? We've got this ship, this roll-on, roll-off ferry booked from Athens to Alexandria in Egypt, as the same route that Francis Birtles took. And then all of a sudden, all hell broke loose with shipping. And so all the ships were cancelled. And then shipping throughout the Mediterranean just stopped, absolutely stopped. Everything was cancelled. And we learned that the only ships that were moving around were ships moving munitions from country to country. So they were all sort of arming up. And it was a very serious time. So,
because you couldn't have done that by land, could you? Because you would have had to go around through Asia Minor, Turkey, and then into Syria, which of course had been in this prolonged state of civil war. So you couldn't have gone that way, could you?
No, that's right. And if you look at Egypt, for example, it's pretty well cut off. So it's sort of got Israel there to the north, to the northeast, and to the west is Libya. And that's a basket case at the moment, Libya. So it's difficult to get into Egypt. So we had all these things lined up in Egypt for us to do, and then there was no shipping. So we just thought, what do we do? And there was a really interesting Albanian guy working in this sort of broken down hotel that we're in, and he said, I'll go to this port of Durrës, which is an Albanian port, and Albania has some sort of deal going with Egypt. And we toyed around with the idea of putting the cars on an Albanian ship, and then we thought it'll probably just disappear. We'll never see it again. So we just decided we'd make a break for Athens and see what we could find. We get to the Greek border, the border of Albania and Greece, and then the phone rings, and it's our shipping guy in Athens. He says, if you can get the car to the Piraeus in Athens by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, this is midday already, so if you can get the cars there, we've got a container we can put them in and get you there. So we drove that 100-year-old car.
You had to fang
it, Richard, somewhere between around the 800 and 900 kilometre mark in the afternoon to get there.
And I have to ask, had you support vehicles?
Oh yes, no, it was there.
Oh, isn't that nice?
And mercifully it hadn't broken down, so we didn't have to turn back and go and tow it out of wherever it was. But no, we did it, and it was an amazing drive through Greece. It was just flat out. And of course, the road, mercifully, once you crossed from Albania into Greece, the roads improved, And
what are local people making of these two strange people dressed in century-old gear in a century-old car going, faster, chap, faster?
Yes, into curling of the moustache, Richard, all that kind of thing.
Like Terry Thomas.
Indeed. And I've even got a gap in my teeth like Terry Thomas too. I've got an absolute shower. So when you get to a border, of course, the border guards were amazed. You kind of look at, they'd come out and they'd just look at this car, and then, they'd be a bit gruff to start with. Next thing, they're having selfies taken with it and all sorts of things. So the car was a wonderful sort of key to, to motoring pleasure, if you like. It was a great thing.
And did you have the century-old attitude, which is that the English language can be understood anywhere in the world so long as it's spoken loudly and clearly?
Pretty much, Richard. We stuck to true form.
Now see here.
Now see here, my good fellow. So absolutely. But look, the border guards in Greece, they were fantastic. They were lovely, and they just wanted their photos taken with the cars, and so you get all these warnings. Be careful when you drive into Greece. Be careful of dogs be careful of, rocks falling on you, all these sorts of things. And it was the most spectacular drive down to Athens.
It sounds like, as with your Peking to Paris adventure, that you're surprised, really, you get all these warnings about how hard it's going to be and how hostile people might be. But what you actually find is this enormous amount of goodwill.
Oh, very much so, Richard. I mean, that is the case. And it's sort of an eye-opener. It wasn't so much an eye-opener for me because as you said, I'd driven the Peking to Paris route and I'd been overseas quite a lot since then doing other motoring things, so it didn't surprise me. But Matthew, for example, I think he had the radar up about going to the Middle East, I think, initially, and going to some of these places. But when he was there, he was just absolutely at home, and, the same for all of us involved.
So you got your bright red bean onto a ship leaving Piraeus in Greece.
Yes.
Went across the eastern Mediterranean down to the port of Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great himself. And how were you greeted once you arrived in Egypt?
Oh, look, Egypt is the most remarkable. I've not been to Egypt before, but it is everything that you imagine it to be and more. We actually flew. We couldn't get on the ship with the cars. You're just not allowed to do that. So we had to fly, which was to fly to Cairo, which it struck me as the most amazing place because the whole city is desert-coloured. Every building is desert-coloured. And then we met two fantastic Egyptian fixers we'd employed, Hatem and Mahmoud, who were just wonderful guys, and they were so enthusiastic about helping us. And they drove us back up to Alexandria, where I don't know if you've been there, Richard. It's madness on wheels. It's full of yellow and black Lada Russian taxis going in every direction, in gridlock, people stepping out in the traffic. It's wonderful. And there's, of course, the Mediterranean there, and there's, where the famous lighthouse stood, and where the Bibliotheca Alexandrina was there, and the Greco-Roman Museum. And it's just wonderful. It is another place that's out of a children's book. And we were greeted just spectacularly. We couldn't have been any better.
You're carrying with you a couple of walkie-talkies for communication. Did they give the guards cause for suspicion?
Now, Richard, this is one of these things. All these things that you learn about. Now, one of the things is that some countries won't let you have drones, for example, and some countries won't let you have this and that. But in Egypt, they're very strict about walkie-talkies. And we'd heard stories about people who are driving out in the desert, and the Egyptian army can triangulate where you are if you're using the walkie-talkie, and they come roaring through the desert and apprehend you. So before we'd left Greece, I'd brought a couple of walkie-talkies with me from Australia, and we'd used them with some success. But when we went to Egypt, we thought, well, I have to get rid of these walkie-talkies. So I find one. I don't know where the other one is. So leave it at the place that we're staying at in Athens, and some lucky Athenian has a really nice walkie-talkie now. So we get to Cairo, to the airport, and I'm walking to the airport and get into customs, and I thought, I might just need to go to the toilet. So I'll just go through my bag, and I'm going through my bag. Here's the other walkie-talkie in the bottom of my bag. I'm going, oh my God, what do I do? And everybody's going, oh my God, what are you going to do? So I went into the toilet and just dumped the walkie-talkie in the waste paper bin. Let's get out of here. And I'm waiting for the alarms to go off. There's some cleaner finding a walkie-talkie.
Exactly. What kind of security incident did that create? Did you shut down the whole that airport?
I was wondering about that because I just thought, some cleaner goes, walkie-talkie, But anyway, we managed to get out of there quick, smart. So that was a pretty good thing.
Once you got to Alexandria, there you were met by the Australian/Egyptian/Greek Australian/Italian Prince Lorenzo Montesini. Now, a guest on this program in the past, how helpful was he?
Now, I cannot sing Prince Lorenzo Montesini's praises enough. Now, for those of you out there who don't remember Prince Lorenzo Montesini, he was famous in the day because he was to marry a Sydney socialite, Primrose Dunlop, and of course, from memory, at the wedding, I think Lorenzo ran off with the best man or something like that. And I met him years ago. He wrote a book called My Life and Other Misdemeanors, and I drew a cartoon in the newspaper, and he contacted me, could he reproduce the cartoon? And so through various circles I've been in contact with him, but when we were preparing this, Egypt was an issue because I don't want to get too complicated, but there are things like carnet de passage, which is an international document, the car's passport. Nearly every country in the world subscribes to this or is a signatory to this, except Egypt. And so getting the cars in and out of Egypt was going to be difficult. So I contacted Lorenzo, who is just a wonderful, florid individual, just wonderful, and so wonderfully eccentric. He really is. He's a delight. And, of course, he has terrific connections in Australia with the Egyptian community and particularly the Egyptian ambassador in Sydney, who's just been wonderful. And so Lorenzo is very heavily involved with the Bibliotheca Alexandrina and the Greco-Roman Museum and then the Grand Egyptian Museum, the GEM in Cairo. And so he was able to open all these doors for us. So anyway, Lorenzo, he turns up there in Alexandria and he is just a walking, talking, the best tour guide you could ever have there because he's from there and he's from that old world of forgotten royalty that was in Egypt. And he was,
when King Farouk was still on the throne.
Of course, yes. And so he has lots of photographs of his beautiful mother and his father was very well placed and they had very expensive American cars, Buicks and Plymouths and all sorts of things.
And the family has like aristocratic Genoan ancestry,
yes,
don't
they do.
Yes,
it's a complicated thing, Richard,
Yes.
and I have asked about it, but it baffles me, but it's so complicated. But I find it fascinating, all those sort of forgotten, royalty things. And they're all sort of interconnect with each other. But he was great, and he was showing us around all sorts of things, where he was born, where his grandmother lived, and this is the apartment where Patrick White was with his lover at the time. I think,
Manoli Lascaris.
Is that who it was?
Yes. Who was from Alexandria as well.
I knew that, Richard. I was just testing.
Yes, I know. Thank you. I get a tick of my homework for that. Now read on. It's a bit like that, isn't it?
Yes.
Podcast? Broadcast? This is Conversations with Richard Fidler. Hear more conversations anytime on the ABC Listen app or abc.net.au/conversations.
So we just left off when you'd arrived in Egypt. Now, if you're standing in Egypt and if you imagine yourself as on a map of the world,
yes.
You've got very motorist unfriendly countries all around you and there's war zones and everything else going on. What was your plan then to get from Egypt to Asia?
Well, Richard, originally Francis Birtles shipped his car to Alexandria. Then he drove across the Suez Canal into the Sinai Desert and he crossed the Sinai. So the Sinai sounds enormous, but it's about the distance from, say, Sydney to Gosford or Sydney to Newcastle. It's not a very big desert by Australian standards. So Birtles found it an absolute knockover to drive across the Sinai. Now, we were intending to do the same thing and go into Jordan, but because of what was happening in Gaza, Jordan was taking a lot of refugees in and it was becoming very dicey at that stage. And we were monitoring. I became obsessed with monitoring the news as to what was happening because everything was deteriorating around us. So we decided to mirror, if you like, or shadow Birtles' drive because he went across the Sinai and then went up into Syria, which you can't do now, obviously, and then into Iraq, and he drove across Iraq that way to Baghdad and down. So what we did was we went from Alexandria down to Cairo and then down to the Red Sea and to a place called Safaga, and then put the vehicles on a roll-on, roll-off ferry that was still operating to cross the Red Sea to Saudi Arabia. So in the meantime, of course, we'd been to Cairo and been to the pyramids and seen all those wonderful things. We know where the first AIF was stationed in Cairo and all sorts of places that we were dying to see. And we went to an amazing place called the Red Pyramid. This is older than the pyramids of Giza, the third biggest pyramid in Egypt. There's three pyramids at Giza. Two of them are the biggest pyramids in Egypt, and the third one is this place called the Red Pyramid, which is about 45 minutes out of Cairo. Now, hardly anybody's seen that because it was on territory that had been sort of a military zone, but all of a sudden had been opened up. So we went to this place and there were no tourists there, none, of this magnificent pyramid. And then there's another one called the Bent Pyramid, which is even older again. So these are very, very old pyramids. And to have the bean car there, I mean, before we'd even left home, I'd mocked up a kind of Photoshop illustration of the bean car, and Matthew and I in our gear with a pyramid behind us. And here we were. It was the real deal. The might of those things. To see the Parthenon in Athens is one thing, but to see the pyramids, that's something altogether different.
You and I both love history. We've both written history books. It's something to feel the intimacy with the ancient world, isn't it? That feeling that the lives of people, the labour of people from thousands of years ago.
It's a giant hand and it grabs you like it takes you in. And it's just so overwhelming and awe-inspiring. It is, yeah.
So then you cross the Red Sea into Saudi Arabia, and your timing for once is really good here because Saudi Arabia's opening up to the world at the moment.
Richard, I didn't know this, but up until very recently, well, Saudi Arabia had been locked off to foreigners for over a century. You could go to Riyadh, the capital for business and that sort of thing, and I think people could come into Saudi Arabia if you were like a mining engineer and you were doing something or other like that. But as you know, Mecca and Medina and those places are off limits, particularly, well,
to infidels like you.
To infidels, yes. Yeah, infidel. But even so, if you're Muslim, you have to apply for a religious permit to go and visit there, and it's not guaranteed you'll get it. So we had actually crossed from Egypt and, of course, from Safaga, and where the Egyptian customs there, they were ferocious with us. They tore all the vehicles apart, tore everything out, put everything through giant X-ray machines, and, we thought we were going to miss the ship. Managed to get it all back in.
And were you saying the whole time, no, you don't understand. We're trying to replicate the voyage of an Australian motorist from the 1920s and dressing in the same... Did you feel like you were slightly mad as you were trying to explain what you were doing to these heavily armed men on the Saudi border?
Sometimes it didn't wash that well, Richard, I have to say. But then again, the customs and police there, I was saying, were very officious. And because they didn't speak English until we were in the clear, then they all spoke English. So it was like, oh, okay. So they were sort of waiting for us to say something that might have been, untoward, which we never did, of course. And we, there was not a problem because we didn't have any issues with anything we had.
Were you expecting a difficult welcome or a warm welcome, and what was the reality of it?
So Saudi Arabia only last April joined the International Carnet Association, which is what Egypt hadn't. So it meant that with an international carnet, for the first time, a foreigner could bring a car into Saudi Arabia. And so we crossed the Red Sea, where there's the Houthis to the south and Gaza to the north. It's all going on. And we crossed to a place called Juba. And then they were delighted to see a carnet. They'd never seen one before, at customs there, and they stamped it and all that sort of thing. And then we set off into Saudi Arabia. Now, my idea of Saudi Arabia, my preconception was it was going to be like a giant sand pit with a few oil derricks here and there. It is the most beautiful country. I cannot begin to tell you, in that region from the Red Sea into the centre of Saudi Arabia. If you Google Earth it, it looks like, a giant wasteland. Well, it isn't. There's something beautiful about it.
Is it like Central Australia? You can look at it on Google Earth and go, well, what's that? But when you're there, you go, this is one of the most beautiful places in the whole world.
But it's different again to Central Australia. Central Australia has beautiful rock formations and landscapes. This is different again. It does look like Mars. It is truly amazing. I mean, you see Wadi Rum up in Jordan there, and of course Petra, the great city that's chiselled into the rock there. Well, there's a city called Hegra in Saudi Arabia, which is the sister city to Petra. And so we drove into this place, which with the 100-year-old car, and it's built at the same time, pretty much the same time as Petra, by the same,
the Nabateans.
Yeah, that's right, the Nabateans, as I was about to say, Richard. And of course, it's so beautiful. The raw, deep history of the place just takes hold of you.
Did you ever feel unsafe in the desert? I mean, not in terms of from other people, but from the conditions in an open 1920s car?
Look, when we were driving through the desert, the hospitality from the locals is something extraordinary. We were driving through the desert. There's an olive tree in the middle of nowhere in the desert. So we decided to pull up in the only bit of shade in the desert. Out of nowhere on the road, this sort of Toyota Camry pulls up, and this very chiselled Saudi Arabian guy gets out, and he's like fresh out of a Tintin book. He's got, the red and white checked shamar and beautifully white robes and, chiselled beard, and he gets out. He can't speak a word of English, but he just sees the car and he just loves it. He has no idea what we're doing. So he talks to Mahmoud, our interpreter, our Egyptian interpreter, and as his generosity, the great Muslim generosity that he displays, he's going to take us to lunch at the next town, which he does. So we follow him into the next town, takes us to this beautiful Indian restaurant. And so we're learning all about Saudi Arabia, because they don't have tourists there, or hardly any tourists, particularly where we were. So all of a sudden, through our interpreter, we discover this chap has 3 wives. So Matthew Benz, my co-driver and editor at large for the Daily Telegraph, he's ex-Fleet Street. Well, this sets him off, and he's like, 3 wives, tell me about that. How does that all work?
Oh, my God.
So I just read a thing the night before on the internet saying 10 things never to ask in the Middle East. In 2 minutes, Matthew had brought up 8. And I'm there going, oh, my God. And anyway, Mahmoud, the interpreter's just going, he's sort of shrinking into his seat. Matthew's going, well, ask him, how does it all work? They all live together under one roof to the, And so this fellow was so lovely and so candid about such an unusual tradition. And he's explaining, no, they're all in different cities, and, I see one here and one here. Wife number one doesn't like wife number two, and wife number one likes wife number three, but and it was the most unbelievable candid interview that we just had with this chap. And he just took it was just normal. But I was going to say it doesn't pass the pub test, but there's no drinking in Saudi Arabia, so I'm not quite sure. It doesn't pass the thick black coffee test. Yeah. And what had happened was, in Saudi Arabia, what we didn't know was that the Australian ambassador, when we saw him in Riyadh, was so excited. We were the first Australians to have ever driven across Saudi Arabia.
You're the first Australians to drive across
Saudi Arabia from the Red Sea to the Gulf. It had never been done before by Australians because you couldn't do it. You could only do it since last April, and nobody had actually had the ambition of driving across Saudi Arabia with Australian number plates on. So,
let alone in a century-old car.
Yeah, so we're the first people to do it in a 100-year-old car, which was a great thing. We had no idea about this, but Mark Donovan, who's the Australian ambassador, was so excited, and he shouted at his luncheon.
Yeah, and I have to ask you too, somehow you became quite famous in Saudi Arabia. How did that happen?
Yeah, well, we learned on the way that we were now becoming the number one story on TikTok in Saudi Arabia. So you'd pull up to some outback servo in the middle of the desert, and all these kids that appear from nowhere, they're getting photographs of the car. You're here, yeah. And even in Egypt, and the same in Saudi Arabia, the police were monitoring us all the time. And we once pulled into this service station, and there was a police four-wheel drive sitting in the middle of nowhere, and then you could see this policeman getting on his two-way radio, and Mahmoud, our interpreter, is killing himself laughing. I said, what's he saying? He's going, Sir, the Australian adventurers are here. They're here. Like, holy cow, he wasn't expecting it. It was wonderful. Just great. Really good.
Number one star on Saudi Arabian TikTok.
That's right.
That's something I've always wanted to happen in me in my life, I think, to be famous on Saudi TikTok, but I don't think I'll ever get there. Congratulations, Warren, on having done that.
Thank you. I can go to my grave happy, Richard.
So you cross the Hijaz of Saudi Arabia from one end to the other to the Gulf. What happens when you hit the Gulf?
Well, this is when we were sort of faced with a couple of things. We got to the United Arab Emirates and we had a great reception in Dubai, of all places, but it was so stiflingly hot, and it was 47 degrees when we were there, and then we hit Dubai traffic. It's different altogether to Saudi Arabia. It's very wealthy, lots of flash-fast cars and skyscrapers as far as the eye can see.
Everything's a freeway.
Everything's a freeway,
Yeah.
And so we get stuck in Dubai traffic. So it's 47 degrees outside. Inside the car, it's about 55 degrees. So we're well and truly cooked by the time we get to the hotel. So Matthew and I are sort of suffering from heat stroke for a couple of days, which is okay. But the key thing was we're so close to Iran. So you just get on a roll-on, roll-off ferry from Dubai to Iran, and you can do that all the time. Iran didn't bother us at all, really. Earlier on it did, when they were sort of launching rockets into Israel. That wasn't looking too good. But what we wanted to do is actually jump on the ferry to Iran, cross through Iran, get into Pakistan. Now, the only thing about Pakistan is it has a province called Balochistan. That's actually how it's pronounced. I looked it up. It's not Baluchistan, it's Balochistan. And it's a fairly ropey kind of province that separates Iran from, the main states of Pakistan.
Right. It doesn't accept the sovereignty of either country, probably, I expect.
It's not, it's a bit of a rogue province.
Right.
And all the time that I've been looking and doing this journey, you could cross the border, but you needed an armed escort. And that was fundamentally some bloke you'd hire and he'd get in with an AK-47.
That wasn't the spirit of your journey, was it? An armed escort, was it?
It wasn't the spirit of it. But even in Birtles' day, he wrote about Balochistan and he didn't like it. He'd been through there twice, and he said even brigands murder for as little as a gun. He travelled unarmed because it was a murderous kind of place. So it was okay, people would cross, but the week before, things started to unravel in Balochistan, and a mob called the BLA, the Balochistan Liberation Army, they were unleashing a sort of program of terrorism and targeting foreigners, and this was unfolding very badly. And I became obsessed with this and daily looking at what was happening in Balochistan, and it was deteriorating to the point where, one of the border crossings we were to cross, a suicide bomber drove in there only about 2 weeks before we were supposed to go through, killed about 9 policemen. They were targeting foreign nationals. So the Chinese were having a Belt and Road initiative. They were building this big thing that they could transport oil from Iran through Balochistan into China. So the Balochistan Liberation Army started it target Chinese nationals who are working on this thing and murdering them. And then Xi Jinping went feral. I was watching all this unfold, and he told the Pakistanis, get in there and you need to look after our nationals, otherwise we'll just pull this whole $1 trillion exercise in your country and get them out. So it kept happening. There was a suicide bombing at Quetta railway station. A busload of foreigners were held up on the road we were going through. They were taken out on the side of the road and shot. And this kept going. There were blockades. Then they started closing the border. This is unravelling like badly, quickly. And if you have a look at Balochistan now, it's unbelievable what's going on there. So it was sort of degenerating into a civil war. We'd always had an agreement between the three of us beforehand to say, well, look, we don't want to get ourselves into a situation where we go from hero to zero in the blink of an eye, and then all of a sudden there's an international incident where people go, hey, what you guys are doing is great, to what the hell were you doing in there?
Yeah.
You know,
so and you become a hostage or something.
Yeah.
So that was it. So you have to reroute then.
Well, what we were intending to do then is put the car on a ship to Mumbai and then go up. We're going to go up from Mumbai into Nepal and then round into Tibet and then round that way.
Ah, so you'd be brown of the Himalayas then.
In the Himalayas, my very word. But what happened was the ship was all ready to go, and then the shipping agent in Dubai says, oh, we've got a bit of a problem. I said, what's that? He says, customs won't recognise that there's such a thing as a bean car. I'm like, what do you mean? He says, it's not in their catalogue. It's like, there's not, like, what do you mean? So there's not, and I'm going, well, so this went on. It was sort of funny for a day. Then after 10 days of not anything happening, and customs just weren't interested in doing anything. They'd stamped the car into the country with the car note, but they wouldn't let it leave. So I'm getting desperate, and I'm saying to them, what have I got to do? Like, here's all the information, and they demand to see the manufacturer's website. I said, they haven't made them since 1929. The manufacturer doesn't have a website. So this went on and on and on. And so we missed our ship, which was absolutely confounding.
So what could you do?
Well, we just decided that, we couldn't get into Myanmar. And if we had to wait another 3.5 weeks to get into India to avoid all that Balochistan stuff, we decided what we'll do is we'll continue on. We'll go to Malaysia, which is where Birtles went. And then when we do the whole thing back to Australia, we'll actually go back and redo what Matthew calls the missing leg. So we're going to do India, we're going to do Bhutan, because we've got an audience with the king there, Nepal, back into Tibet and around again.
So you get to Malaysia, the Malay Peninsula, and that's where you met the king of Malaysia?
This is the most incredible story, Richard. So what happened with Francis Birtles? The big Birtles story for me was him being in Burma, but we couldn't get in there. So he was very lucky to get in there and get out of there. He got stopped. He had to put his car on a ship. He missed Thailand, or Siam as it was, altogether. He put on a ship and he landed in Malaysia. So we did the same thing. And the king of Malaysia has this incredible car collection that no one ever sees. And you often, if you're sort of into sort of vintage car circles, you can see at some auction, some very expensive car, has come up for auction. Oh, it's been bought by the king of Malaysia, who's the Sultan of Johor, and it's gone into his collection and probably never to be seen again because it's so secretive. But what we learned was that he's also a cartoon buff. And so the king had asked for me to draw a caricature of him. So we had an audience, a personal audience with the king of Malaysia at his palace. And so we turned up. It was the most amazing thing. We go to his home, which is sort of like a mini palace, and there's the grand palace, which is about 10 minutes away. And so we're all a bit nervous, and we're ushered inside very early in the morning, and the king, with a few theatrics, I think, going on, he's in another room and he's shouting out to somebody rather, "You have just signed your own death warrant."
Well, that's what I was going to ask, because it's a rotating monarchy, isn't
it is.
Like there are all these sultans of Malaysia, and they take turns
every
on the throne.
5 years. That's
every
right.
5 years. Previous kings of Malaysia, sultans-in-chief of Malaysia, have known to be mercurial chaps like that. This sultan, this king, wants you to draw
a caricature
of him. Were you frightened?
I was absolutely terrified, Richard. But having said that, when he came out and he sat down, he was really gracious. And I mean, he was lovely, very modern king, and he likes to promote himself as a man of the people. And so when he sat down, I think he was amazed, because I just sort of drew him very quickly. And I made him look, very much like Chris Hemsworth, because I valued my neck so much, you see. And then all of a sudden, he sort of, in the course of that, would you like to see my car collection? And we just went, oh, Okay, sure. He says, well, come with me. And we go out to his brand new Rolls-Royce Cullinan SUV and we hop in that. Next thing, there's a whole full-blown motorcade. Motorbikes and black SUVs and, the motorbikes overtake. And the King's driving flat out to the palace, which we get into the palace where he has tigers and all sorts of things in there. And we had...
tigers? Like stuffed tigers or live tigers?
So he has real tigers in there. But the tigers they're like rescue tigers. They're tigers that have been found when they've been logging the jungle or whatever. Yeah, rescue tigers, or they've been injured or whatever else. But he told this story about how only last year he had turned his back on a tiger in one of the cages there, and it jumped on him, and he had however many stitches on his back. Oh. And we said, well, what did you do? And he said, the tiger picked the wrong guy. I punched it in the nose, And so I drew a cartoon of him punching the tiger in the nose, which I think he really liked.
So you go down the peninsula, go through Singapore, get on a boat and arrive finally in Darwin. Now, you'd think you'd be feeling like you were home, but my word, Darwin's a very long way from Melbourne, isn't it?
It is. Well, Richard, in my mind's eye, you think Australia, it's not that far. And, I've been to Darwin and I've driven, through the middle of Australia. But if you superimpose a map of Europe over Australia, if you think of where Darwin is as Glasgow in Scotland, Melbourne is where Cairo is in Egypt, with the Mediterranean in the middle of it. So that's how big Australia is. And as I mentioned before, the payback was that we arrive in Darwin in the wet season. And, of course, the humidity there is something to behold. And thanks also to Border Force and Quarantine, the guys up there just did the best job in helping us get through. Francis Birtles had a hell of a time in 1928. They impounded the car. They wanted him to pay customs duty. He ended up having to ring the Prime Minister Stanley Milburn Bruce and gave him an earful, and Stanley Milburn Bruce had to get the customs guy on the phone and release the car to get him out of my ear, But the Quarantine and Customs were fantastic. We had the car out of there within about 24 hours, but it was so hot.
And were you going down through the middle of Australia or around the coast?
No, down through the middle of Australia. So down through the Stuart Highway. Now, when Birtles did it, there was no Stuart Highway. There was just the overland telegraph track. Stuart Highway wasn't built until World War II when they were trying to supply Darwin. But we drove down all the way down from Darwin down through the centre to Tennant Creek, and then drove across from Tennant Creek through Mount Isa and all the way down to Brisbane, and then down the coast to Melbourne.
Now, this whole adventure was a means to raise funds for the Royal Flying Doctor Service.
Indeed.
Now, at this point, you're in Australia, you're in remote and regional Australia.
Yes.
What did people tell you about the RFDS when they found out you were doing this to raise funds for the RFDS?
Richard, I can't stress to everyone listening, just how well regarded and what high esteem the Royal Flying Doctor Service is held in. People wouldn't be living out there if it wasn't for them. We would pull up to a servo in the middle of nowhere, like outside of Mataranka or somewhere, and then they'd see, you're raising money for the Royal Flying Doctor Service. Yeah, the fuel's free. Don't worry about it. That's cool. People come up, here's $50, 50 into the tin. Here's $100. We pulled up in Tambo, I think it was, and there was a guy there, a young guy, probably about 20, who just won some money on a poker machine or a horse race or something, and he gave all the money to us, $300. Went straight to the Royal Flying Doctor Service. And we pulled into their base at Mount Isa, and those people are so committed and brilliant, wonderful people, all whip smart, incredible. We're having a big adventure. Every day of their lives is a huge adventure as to where they go. And, we were running into people. We ran into a woman who was running this little tiny petrol station on her own. And she said, they saved my life a month ago. I had a stroke and they flew in and picked me up. A cafe owner in Miles in Queensland, she said, yeah, they saved my life. I was bitten by a brown snake while doing some gardening and they flew in and picked me up. And everyone out there has a story. If it's not about them, it's about a relative or a friend, but it's not like, a friend of a friend. It's that direct. They are so important.
So you motor on down the East Coast, and then you finally arrive in Melbourne. You've done it.
Yes.
Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is there to meet you,
yes,
which is fantastic.
Look, we had this wonderful beginning at Australia House on the Strand in London, and we had a letter presented to us written by King Charles, wishing the Birtles and the Bean Boys all the best. So we needed to finish with a big bang. Who better than the Prime Minister of Australia, Anthony Albanese? So I'd walked Kokoda with the PM last Anzac Day, so I had his mobile phone number in my phone. I thought, I'll give it a try. And he said, yeah, I'd love to do it. So,
and then when you rang him, did he answer it, or did a helper answer it?
No, I just texted him and he texted me straight back.
You can just ring up the Prime Minister.
Yeah, I can ring up the Prime Minister, absolutely, which is pretty cool.
Would you share his number with all of us now?
Certainly, Richard. Do you have a pen pencil handy, everyone. And look, he was so gracious and wonderful. He said, yeah, I'd love to do it. And so we met at the old Melbourne GPO, which is where Francis Birtles pulled up in 1928. So when he pulled up, there was a crowd of something like 10,000 to see him. He pulled up outside the GPO and a traffic cop says, you can't park here, mate. You're obstructing traffic. You've got to move on. So he couldn't even stay. So 100 years later, at least we got to stay. We had the car on the footpath there, thanks to Melbourne City Council. Thank you very much for that. And the Lord Mayor was there. The Prime Minister arrived and he was great fun. And we had him sign the car, which was just great.
Now you're home and you're back in Australia and life is as it was before you left, I suppose. Does it feel all like a dream now, going through the pyramids, through the jungles of the Malay Peninsula, all of that? Does it feel strange to you? Is there part of you that wonders whether the whole thing wasn't fictional?
Well, it is a little bit like that. It was somewhat dreamlike, the whole thing, like almost in a snowstorm in the Austrian Alps, and then in a sandstorm in the Arabian desert, and then in the steaming jungles of Malaysia and Singapore and these sorts of things.
Warren, I know you're a great admirer, as I am, of the Apollo space missions. Is there a plan afoot, and may I put it in front of you, to perhaps take a replica of the Apollo 11, put back together with a bit of, Aussie know-how?
Yeah, well, absolutely. A bit like in Apollo 13, the movie,
right.
How they saved that bit by making bits out of cardboard
That's
and
right.
gaffer tape. Well, I'm building a full-scale model of Apollo 11 out of paddle pop sticks, no less. It'll be a wonderful, wondrous thing, Richard.
I have one bit of advice for you. Don't listen to the naysayers, Warren.
We had plenty of those, don't you worry, and it gives me great delight in coming back to Australia and saying, well, yeah, we're here. So there you go.
So do you want to just do that right now? I think you're entitled to it. Can you give a great big no to the naysayers?
Right, so all you naysayers out there, no. What a hoot, Richard.
Huzzah. Congratulations,
Huzzah.
Warren. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you.
Warren Brown is the author of the biography of Francis Birtles, and he has done this thing. He's driven his car, he's towed his car all the way from London to Melbourne. Today's conversation with Warren Brown was produced on the lands of the Gadigal, Turrbal and Jagera peoples. Producer is Nicola Harrison and Maggie Morris. Executive producer is Carmel Rooney. I'm Richard Feidler. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Richard Feidler. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.